pleasant good Tuesday evening to all of you out there viewing our little production here on the campus of Cal State University, Dominguez Hills. This is Straight Ahead Jazz Plus. We're going to get a little plus tonight. Looking forward to the next 3 hours. I'm Chet Hanley, and as always, we are coming to you live and in living black and white and color. That's right. Again, from the campus of CSUDH via LA 36, all of its local affiliates. And we are also coming your way via the internet at la36.org or DHTV Live. There is our number into our room here. As always, 800-339-1193. If you'd like to give us a call here in our room on campus, I'd be more than happy to take your call. Probably take calls up until about 9:30 this evening. We'll be with you through 10 p.m. as always, and we're going to have some fun tonight. I always love to at least once, if not a couple of times each semester, feature this thing that has many monikers, many names. Afro-Latin music, Afro-Cuban jazz, and on and on and on. Let's just call it rhythmically, I'll get it out, rhythmically complex, but eminently danceable. This is some exciting music that I'm going to feature for the next 3 hours and going to have a little fun doing it. I'll dispense with the housekeeping. There's really no need for housekeeping other than the information I've already shared with you, telephone number, how to make contact with us. I failed to mention that you can also send me an email if you wish. And there are a couple of ways you can do that, but the primary way is askdhtvlive@gmail.com. Again, there is your email address if you'd like to send us some words of wisdom or some comments. I'd be more than happy to address them on the air this evening. Needless to say, we're spending our time concentrating on, as I said, I'm going to call it Latin jazz, and we're going to feature the music that came out of Cuba. We may even make a detour and head down to Brazil, time permitting. Nevertheless, exciting music. I think all of you who call yourself jazz fans, and I know most, if not all of you, are diehard jazz fans, you're going to get a kick out of this evening's presentation, as you have in previous semesters. We kicked things off. We went all the way back to 1957. That's right, 1957. The date entitled Más Ritmo Caliente. There's some hot rhythms going on, folks, here tonight. From 57, this is Cal Tjader's date. A couple of recordings were made back in 57. One was Ritmo Caliente, and this is a follow-up called Más Ritmo Caliente. Cal Tjader and the Cats. These names are all legends in Latin jazz. Cal Tjader, of course, on vibraphone. Jose Chombo Silva on tenor saxophone. Gerald Sanfino on flute. Now check out the rest of these gentlemen. You got a taste of pianist Vince Guaraldi of Peanuts fame. The bassist on this gig, the legendary Bobby Rodriguez, not the trumpet player, but the legendary bass player out of the East Coast. And some of the most extraordinary Latin percussionists of all time working with Cal Tjader. And Cal Tjader hired only the best back in the 1950s. And on this particular tune, they included the great Armando Peraza on congas, Mr. Ramon Santamaria, also on conga. You know him as Mongo Santamaria. Luis Kant, playing other Latin percussion on this particular tune. And the gentleman playing timbales, the legendary Willie Bobo. Stay tuned. Again, the tune from the date entitled Más Ritmo Caliente, the tune Perfidia Cha-Cha. And that was definitely a cha-cha. You may sit down now for you dancers out there. But all of this music we're going to share with you tonight is going to connect with you, I think. Like most of the stuff I've shared with you throughout this term. This is session number 8. I can't believe we are halfway through our term. The fall of 2017, again, from the campus of Cal State Dominguez Hills. We're going to continue with some video footage for you that features one of the great pianists of all time from the world of Latin music. First came on the scene, actually came on the scene prior to his co-leadership of one of the great bands, call it a fusion band, the band called Irakere. He co-founded that great band, Mr. Jesus Chucho Valdez. This is Chucho's gig that was recorded in France, specifically Marcillac in France in 2008. This is Chucho Valdez's octet, and they're going to do a little tune that Chucho wrote entitled Danzón. This is Chucho Valdez and his Latin Jazz Messengers. I think you'll get a kick out of this. Truly a giant in every way, Mr. Chucho Valdez and his ensemble, recorded in 2008, his composition entitled Danzón. Some great, great Latin rhythms going on. Of course, Chucho out front on piano. I say a giant in every way, not only one of the great pianists of our time, but a giant of a man, roughly 6'5", 6'4", 6'5", and has been a band leader for many, many years, composer, and truly one of the virtuosos of the keyboard. Chucho Valdez. I'm not going to mention all the members of the octet. However, the extraordinary soprano saxophonist, Mr. Germán Velasco, he also, on other tunes played during this engagement, played alto saxophone as well. But in this case, you heard him on soprano saxophone. Danzón, the name of the tune, from 2008. Chucho Valdez and his Afro-Cuban Messengers. Great stuff. Again, this is Straight Ahead Jazz Plus. We emanate from the campus of California State University, Dominguez Hills, over LA 36. We stream live at la36.org. We also stream via DHTV live. Lots of ways to check us out. Our topic this particular evening is Latin jazz. By any other name, it's infectious music, I think you'll agree. Next up, we're going to feature La Rumba, some great rumberos, interpretive dancers dancing to some unbelievable rhythms. I've shared this footage that I'm about to share on many occasions, and each time I see it, I smile because it's so infectious. The musicians on the date include two great, great percussionists, Mr. Carlos Patato Valdez and Mr. Orlando Rios, also known as Puntilla. This is Patato y Puntilla. This was recorded back in the year 2000. Some great cats on the date, percussionists in particular, including Mr. Pedrito Martinez and bassist Andy Gonzalez. And again, this putting the spotlight on these great percussionists working with two rumberos as they do some serious interpretation of some serious rhythms. Enjoy this next clip.
Si para que of
That's the real deal, folks. Carlos Patato Valdez, he was the gentleman in the check cap. And Orlando Rios, also known as Puntilla, he was the gentleman with the glasses playing congas as well. And just some giants in this band. Among them, Andy Gonzalez on bass, Pedrito Martinez also on congas and vocal lead. This comes from a date that I suspect many of you out there in the jazz world and the Latin jazz world have in your library. It's a Fernando Trueba production entitled Calle 54, and it features some of the giants of Latin jazz, including the likes of Tito Puente and Chucho Valdez, who I just featured previous, Chucho's father, Bebo Valdez, and many, Chano Dominguez, Paquito de Rivera, many others on this particular DVD. One of the top DVDs in my collection from the year 2000. And of course, you saw those two interpretive dancers telling quite a story if you followed along. And I'm not going to even attempt to interpret that story in dance, but I suspect it has something to do with boy meets girl, boy wants girl, girl says back off, you so-and-so, and the rest is history. Again, from Calle 54, Patato Valdez and Puntilla from 2000. Next up, depending on your source material, this next gentleman we're going to feature was born in either 1922 or he was born 100 years ago in 1917. Again, depending on your source. I'm going to go on the premise that he indeed was born in 1917, and any number of great jazz people, music people were born in 1917. And I have shared some of their artistry in previous weeks. People like Thelonious Monk, Dizzy Gillespie, Buddy Rich, Ella Fitzgerald. And according to more than one resource that I've gone back to many times, Mongo Santa Maria. But I've seen others that indicate that he was born in 1922. Nevertheless, what a legacy of music he left all of us. We're going to feature Mongo Santa Maria's ensemble. This was recorded in 1984, and they are going to play arguably Mongo Santa Maria's most popular and well-known tune entitled Afro Blue. This is Mongo Santa Maria and his ensemble from 1984. The one, the only, one of the great congueros of all time, Mr. Mongo Santamaria. His ensemble from 1984. His composition entitled Afro Blue. I think all of you are very, very familiar with that particular tune, interpreted by any number of jazz musicians over the years. I want to share a book with you in just a moment that features as the cover subject the gentleman who headed up this great band, Mr. Ramon Mongo Santamaria. The gentleman in the band at the time, at the trap kit on drums, Mr. Bobby Sanabria. Stay tuned. You're going to hear from Bobby Sanabria in just a moment. The great chequere player, Mr. Sal Santamaria. Eddie Allen on trumpet. Sam Furness on baritone saxophone. Mr. Tony Henson took that stirring tenor saxophone solo. Also, I played a little cowbell for you as well. The musical director of this great band, Mr. Bob Quaranta, and the bassist who came to visit us several years ago as part of, whose ensemble was it? I think maybe Bobby Matos' ensemble. They came in and entertained all of you out there who had and took the opportunity to tune us in many years ago. Mr. Eddie Resto. Again, Mongo Santamaria, his ensemble from 1984. The tune, Afro Blue, and as I said before you heard this great band, depending on what you read, Mongo was born 100 years ago in 1917, or perhaps he was born in 1922. I leave that for you to research. As I generally do when I feature Afro-Cuban music or Afro-Cuban jazz or Afro-Latin jazz, depending on the label you'd like to attach to it, I provide for you some historical perspective. And in most semesters, I share what you're about to see that gets into the roots of Afro-Cuban music. And in this first segment of several, the focus is going to be on, again, the roots, the beginnings, with the focus on the drum and some very important people who made this music what it is early on. People like Arsenio Rodriguez, Cantante Benny Moré, and the one, the only Mr. Damaso Perez Prado. So this is part one of several, actually part two, and I won't go with you there. This is part two. Part one was those rumberos dancing to those great percussionists, Patato Valdez and Puntilla. Now we get into the roots. Some history for you I think you'll enjoy if you've never seen these particular clips, which I try and show each and every semester, but it never hurts to watch it once again, so enjoy this.
Afro-Cuban music, whether it be charanga, Latin big band, small band, which we call conjunto, is all from Africa. Everything we trace back to Africa.
This richness of music that is centuries old has traveled within the African diaspora to the New World, meaning the Great Antilles, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Haiti and Santo Domingo.
The rhythm patterns of these people comes from the Yoruba tribe, which were the most sophisticated drummers in Africa.
There's something majestic about the drum, and very visceral.
Always been called savage music. It's not savage at all. Probably one of the more sophisticated musics on the planet.
The Spanish conquistadors, they sort of turned their face, turned the other way to the music of the slaves. But let them have their music, let them have their dancing, let them enjoy themselves a little bit. Much different from the slave owner in the U.S., who was such a control freak. They took the drum, they took their names, they took everything.
They never allowed their drum here. By not allowing the drum, they lost the Africanism. And little by little, from working eventually the plantations and all that, what you came out of there was the blues, the classic blues. But the Caribbean is different because the black African captive is allowed his drum.
The drum is part of the language. So I think because of the drum, blacks in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, in Haiti, and Santo Domingo were able to retain some of the language and some of the customs.
If you didn't have a drum, you wouldn't have music.
The drum, which is what imitates the pulse of life, is the essence of our music.
The West African rhythms took root in one Caribbean island above all others.
The mambo is Cuban. The cha-cha-cha is Cuban. The danzón is Cuban. The guaracha is Cuban. The son is Cuban. The son montuno is Cuban. The guajira is Cuban. You can't find another country that's given us as many things as Cuba has given us.
The bedrock of African-Cuban music was transformed by Arsenio Rodriguez, a master of the Cuban mandolin known as the tres. Arsenio took the Cuban folk tradition called el son and created an original, bigger sound.
Arsenio Rodriguez, here's a man born in the Congo who was kicked in the head by a mule when he was 8 years old and blinded. Before Arsenio, all there was sextetos and septetos. There was no formal orchestra. They were charangas, but there was no orchestra or conjuntos. So what Arsenio did, the first thing he did is he added the conga drums to the orchestra. Can you imagine a Latin orchestra without a tomadora, without a conga drum? I mean, it's practically unimaginable to me. Well, he was the first one to add a conga drum to the septetos. After that, he added a piano. There were no pianos in the bands, so they were just little guitars and one trumpet. Then he added 2 trumpets, then 3 trumpets, and then written arrangements for the trumpets.
Arsenio's new sound established an intimacy between the musicians and the dancers, a dynamic that inspired the mambo.
He was the first one to use the word mambo.
Mambo was a section of the song that the dancers would escalate their movement and get more excited.
In 1930, while the Depression was raging, Americans were looking for a diversion. Little did they know what was headed their way.
As far as the music getting here to the United States, the first band that comes here to really expose Cuban music on a mass level is the Don Aspiazu Havana Casino Orchestra. They come to New York City in 1930. All of a sudden, people for the first time are seeing instruments that they've never seen or heard before in a theater setting. Bongo, claves, maracas, timbales. These rhythms that are very, very exotic to the average person at that time. They see an orchestra that's multiracial. They have a trumpet player named Humberto Chino Lara, who's a Chinese Cuban. Then they look at the rest of the band. Some of the guys look Italian, some of the guys look Greek or whatever. It's a perfect example of what the Caribbean is. So this was a very exciting thing.
Beyond culture, the Don Aspiazu Havana Casino Orchestra crossed another Rubicon and created the first Latin hit across America, El Manicero, the peanut vendor.
We had a very flamboyant singer named Antonio Machín who came out singing the peanut vendor and throwing peanuts to the crowd. It was a great gimmick. Everybody went nuts. As soon as it came out, within a year of that release, the major jazz performers in the United States covered it and recorded it and did their own versions of that. And I think quite revealing is Louis Armstrong's version, because it shows you where the American public was really at in terms of their perceptions of Cuba. I'm sure he didn't speak Spanish. And he starts to do a little scat. He doesn't know Spanish, so he just throws the word Spanish in there. And it really shows you that he himself probably viewed this as more of a novelty and not as something that was necessarily going to be here to stay.
Yet, as they say in Hollywood, the peanut vendor had legs.
Let's dance.
Oh, do you think if you ask me while we're dancing, you'll have better luck?
Let's try.
The peanut vendor foreshadowed a classic conflict between the authentic African-Cuban music and the homogenized version for the mass market. The biggest star at the casino hotels was Benny Moré, nicknamed the Barbarian of Rhythm. Moré took the son tradition of folk music and infused it with a big band sound. A child of poverty who worked in the sugarcane fields, Moré was a self-taught performer who never forgot his roots. In 1945, Moré moved to Mexico and performed and recorded with Damaso Perez Prado, whose hit Cherry Pink and Apple Blossom White sold millions worldwide and proclaimed him the king of mambo.
I play for you your favorite number, Cherry Pink, the trumpet solo, Jaime Calderón.
Just internationalized mambo. Mexico also, let's not forget, they had a film industry. It was very important in those days before television. All of a sudden you saw somebody who was sort of directing and singing, and he was Perez Prado, the mambo king, and that was it. And that's what you saw, and if you saw it, and that must be true, and that's it. Never heard about cachao or the Cuban side of stuff.
I remember the first night I saw Perez Prado. It was like seeing Star Wars for the first time. They were spread all over the stage, and he was in the middle, and he did all these wild dances. A little bitty dude, sharp, and it's really, really exciting.
And he was a showman, and he brought it forward.
Perez Prado never had a better student of showmanship than Benny Moré, who returned to Cuba to form his own big band.
Big bands had singers, but the big band had a name, Tommy Dorsey, and you are a singer for the Tommy Dorsey band. Benny Moré was Benny Moré.
Moré's popularity soared in Cuba, and he was hailed as the island's greatest entertainer, on the level of Frank Sinatra.
Que no te quiero, si tu amor es la fuente que me inspira a vivir y sentirme tan feliz. Alma mía, ten confianza y comprende que te quiero.
When Benny Moré died of alcohol abuse in 1963, the response on the streets of Cuba was overwhelming.
Most, if not all, of the individuals you saw in this particular clip, not only the artists that were part of the history of this music, but also those providing the history for you, are addressed in this particular book that I want to share with you. Again, it's simply called Afro-Cuban Jazz. It's a 2000 publication and written by Scott Yanow. And you've heard that name before because he has published roughly about a dozen books on various subjects that relate to music, most of which connect to jazz. And in this case, Afro-Cuban Jazz, Scott Yanow, 2000. Great musicians, influential groups. He provides thumbnail biographies on the greats in this genre. He also considers roughly 500 recordings of music recorded by some of the greats, including the likes of the cover subject on this book, Mr. Mongo Santamaria. And all of the people you heard mentioned as part of the history, the Arsenio Rodriguezes, and those that provided commentary for you, like Ruben Blades and Eddie Palmieri, are addressed in this particular book. And if we can get our overhead camera working, if not now, later in the broadcast, I'll share this cover for you so you can look for it in your bookstore, or like, as is the case these days, you go online and you press a button and you get it with one click. My, how times have changed. But I strongly recommend this book. There are any number of books on the genre. There it is. All right. It's magic, I tell you. The magic of television. There's Mongo Santa Maria on the cover, Afro-Cuban Jazz by Scott Yanow. Great musicians, influential groups, 500 recordings reviewed, and he even rates them. But you do your own rating. Go out and check out some of these titles and listen to them, then you can form your own opinions on how, whether or not they connect with you. That's the bottom line. Afro-Cuban Jazz. It's a must-read, I think, for those of you who are fans of this music. All righty, let us return to our historical perspective for you. In this case, some additional names are going to be mentioned. One in particular is so vitally important when you're talking about combining Afro-Cuban rhythms with jazz sensibilities. So mention is going to be made of, among others, the great Mario Bauza and Francisco Grillo. You know him as Machito and his Afro-Cubans. And we'll come back.
In 1930, a 19-year-old Cuban named Mario Bauza arrived in New York. A classically trained clarinetist, he had visited the city 4 years earlier and fallen in love with jazz. Now he was back, intent on making it in the burgeoning big band scene. In Cuba, prejudice against his dark skin had held him back. New York had race barriers as well, but in Havana, there was no Harlem.
Unless you know rhythm, unless you like music, unless you keep dancing, you can't live in Harlem.
All the big club with all those terrific shows in Harlem there. Right at 3 o'clock in the morning was like a 12 o'clock in the day in Times Square.
In his own words, well, he found that it was a place where he could walk down the street and not experience the same kind of racism that he was experiencing in Havana at the time, that he could feel free as a black man walking down the street and not feel that oppression in the same way.
Just a few years later, after a switch to trumpet, Bauza was playing at the Savoy Ballroom for Harlem's King of Swing, Chick Webb. Bauza became the orchestra's musical director and lead trumpet player. Taken with Bauza's musicianship, Webb had personally rehearsed him in what he called the vocabulary of jazz, helping him adapt to the feel of swing.
Getting more da-da-ba-doo-ba-da-ba-doo-ba-da-ba-doo-ba-da-ba-doo-ba-da. Whereas Latin is, it tends to be strictly bakum 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 bakum.
Even as Bauza made inroads into American jazz, Cuban music was entering the American mainstream. In 1931, an orchestra from Havana released El Manicero, the Peanut Vendor. It became a surprise smash hit. The million seller launched the rumba dance craze of the 30s, and so-called Latin bands became a standard ballroom attraction. The stage was set for a musical revolution led by Mario Bauza. It started with an insult.
Mario was insulted by some comments by a musician in the Cab Calloway Orchestra when he played him some of the music of Cuba. He said, hey, that sounds like hillbilly music, country music. He goes, yeah, it's the music of my country, Cuba. But one day there'll be a band, just like this band, the Cab Calloway band, real classy, elegant, with modern harmonies, etc. So it's going to have an Afro-Cuban rhythm section. And I'm going to tell you, it's going to sound better than this band.
You ever hear the expression, merengue lemon pie? This is exactly what it is. Jazz in the top, and the Afro-Cuban rhythm in the bottom.
Bauza's first step was to recruit his brother-in-law, bringing him up from Cuba. To the world, he'd become known as Machito.
Machito, his real name was Francisco Raúl Gutiérrez Grillo de Ayala. His nickname when he was a kid was Macho, and then the story goes that a promoter in New York City told him, that sounds like too harsh. Is there any way to make that a little bit softer? Like, how would you say little Macho? So he goes, oh, Machito. So that's how basically he got his moniker.
He was the kind of man that was the salt of the earth, really, the salt of the earth. And what a pair of nobody could play maracas like him. And the way he sang was just completely endearing.
Bauza's fusion of an African-American big band with traditional Cuban rhythms was groundbreaking, right down to its name.
Just the fact that the name that they chose for that band was Machito and his Afro-Cubans says a lot.
Machito is Afro-Cubano. Why the people object that Afro thing there?
It's the first time where we see this kind of public acknowledgement through the naming of the band of something that is African-derived.
I'm of African descent. And the rhythm, the producing music we play is African.
Nobody was acknowledging Africa. All of a sudden this band comes out and right in your face it says Machito and the Afro-Cubans.
Bauza and Machito had a strong base to work from. Granted U.S. citizenship in 1917, over 30,000 Puerto Ricans had migrated to New York, many settling in East Harlem, which came to be known as El Barrio, or Spanish Harlem. The mix of jazz and traditional rhythms spoke directly to this new generation of New York Latinos. They provided both an audience and musicians for the band.
You know, when I heard that band in person, in the flesh.
Break in here and kind of bring you up.
Looking around, you know.
On our history. Our history lesson for the evening. We are not well into our second of 3 hours, but we're just beginning the second of our 3 hours from the campus of Cal State Dominguez Hills over LA 36, its local affiliates, as well as Dominguez Hills Television. Hopefully you were with me from the beginning. Our focus is on Afro-Latin jazz or Afro-Cuban jazz or Afro-Cuban music, Afro-Caribbean music, a lot of titles. You select the one that you like. You heard a couple of very, very important names mentioned, namely Mr. Mario Bauza. You heard the explanation that he began in Chick Webb's great swing band that featured, among others, a very, very young Miss Ella Fitzgerald. Speaking of 100 years, Ella Fitzgerald, indeed born in 1917. And all over the world, they are celebrating the artistry of Miss Ella Fitzgerald. Stay tuned. And of course, Francisco Grillo, also known as Machito, and his band called the Afro-Cubans. Very significant name for that band, as you heard. you heard mention of the fact that not only did Mario Balsa play in Chick Webb's orchestra, he also played in Cab Calloway's orchestra. Now that's an important distinction to remember as we continue our history of the development of this particular musical art form. What you're going to hear next is one of the great cats in the realm of Afro-Cuban rhythms and jazz, Mr. Frank Colon, commenting on the sound that was made by these great big bands. And mention is going to be made of a composition by Mario Balsa entitled Tanga. And we're going to begin to close, not the gap, but pull elements together that ultimately resulted in some extraordinary fusion music. That's right, the coming together of two very distinct art forms. Stay tuned. In that regard, you're going to hear mention made of a young man who happened to also serve time, wrong term, spent time in the Cab Calloway Orchestra alongside Mario Balsa. Let's continue our journey with some comments by the one, the only Mr. Frank Colon.
You know, when I heard that band in person, in the flesh, and I heard those drummers and going how they started, and I just looking around, you know, I felt like that feeling you get in your nose when you're gonna cry or something, and you try to, it just destroyed me. Damn! And I'm looking at, ooh, man, I look at the people, and people were dancing, baya, papi, and I'm saying, hey, this is impossible. This is impossible, you know? Man, it changed my whole life. That was one of the experiences that stay with me till I'm in the tomb.
An immediate success in El Barrio, Machito and his Afro-Cubans became a bridge between worlds when they also found success with white audiences in Midtown Manhattan, becoming the house band at the La Conga Club for 3 years. Though the Afro-Cubans succeeded with varied audiences, that didn't mean everyone heard the music the same way.
It's almost like a double performance. Performing a piece that was translating to a general audience as a swinging, killing dance piece. But at the same time, there would be messages, coded messages for those people in the know.
Tanga, Buruboya!
Buruboya. You know, it goes by so fast that you hardly recognize it. But anybody who was a practitioner of Santeria would look up, and because it's a traditional greeting.
During the 1940s, the Afro-Cubans developed what became a landmark composition and the band's theme song, Tanga.
There. It's what Mario Balsa and Machito were really pushing for. Jazz improvisation over really, intense Afro-Cuban grooves.
And you get this wall of sound happening with the horns. It's like a tidal wave of sound coming at you. It just stays on one chord. Boom. And it just gets more intense and more intense and more intense and more intense. It was the harbinger of the experiments that Miles Davis would eventually start doing much, much later.
With music like Tanga, the Afro-Cubans quickly drew the attention of the most innovative jazz artists, including an old friend and bandmate of Mario Balsa's.
And who comes in at the very end? Dizzy Gillespie. The trumpets were here, saxes were there, the rhythm, he's sitting right there. He wanted to hear that thing coming right through. And so Mario, seeing that Dizzy's there, he said, all right, let's take out the heavy stuff. He look around to Mario, hey baby, knock me out, play some more of that stuff. And I know when Dizzy left that night, man, he didn't know where to put his brains in.
Dizzy Gillespie played such an important role in the history of music. But when you consider his contributions to jazz, to swing, to Afro-Cuban jazz, he's right up there with the likes of Mario Balsa and Machito and others that you're going to hear about this evening. That's right, Dizzy and Mario Balsa played in the same trumpet section for the great Cab Calloway. And Dizzy's interactions with those gentlemen resulted in some extraordinary, groundbreaking music, some of which you're going to hear this evening. Speaking of Dizzy Gillespie, we're going to fast forward and go to the year 1966, and feature the great Dizzy Gillespie. Many of you probably know that subsequent to Dizzy's interactions with Mario Balsa, he interacted with a great conguero, bongocero, dancer. He did so many things, Mr. Chano Pozo. And that collaboration resulted in they were co-composers of a couple of tunes that I think many of you are well aware of. One, Manteca, and the other one, Dizzy's going to play for you in duo fashion with his bassist at the time, Mr. Chris White. This was recorded in the UK in 1966 as part of the Jazz 625 series. And you've heard Dizzy's artistry in previous sessions this term, and you'll continue to hear Dizzy Gillespie because of his important role in the history of this music. So in this case, we're going to let Dizzy introduce the tune, and he and Chris White are going to come together and share it with you. Again, from 1966, the great John Burke's Dizzy Gillespie.
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Another one of my original compositions in collaboration with the late, great Congo drummer, Chano Pozo. And this one is titled Tin Tin Deo.
Along with the likes of Ella Fitzgerald and Buddy Rich and Thelonious Monk. The world, literally the world, is celebrating the 100th anniversary of Dizzy Gillespie's birth. That's right, he was born in 1917. That's confirmed, 1917. The great Dizzy, 1966, working with his bassist at the time, Mr. Christopher White, as they interpreted a composition co-written by Dizzy Gillespie and Chano Pozo entitled Teen Teen Deo. And Dizzy, one of the most recognizable figures in the history of music, period. And I don't have to tell you why he's one of the most recognizable figures. But truly a giant of giants, not only a virtuoso trumpet player, but composer, big band leader, small band leader, teacher. As I have said many, many times in past semesters, Dizzy was one of those folks who enjoyed interacting with musicians and showing him certain progressions, chord progressions, accidentals, you name it. Dizzy was right there sitting at the piano teaching fellow musicians on how to get to certain places in the music, within the music. Dizzy was a giant, truly. And you heard his virtuosity on the trumpet. And in his introduction to this tune, Dizzy liked to have a good time, but this was a pretty straight introduction on his part. Kind of rare, because Dizzy was something else. Liked to have fun, a comedian, dancer, he did everything. The great John Burks Gillespie. We're going to return to our historical perspective, again, some more important names that are going to be mentioned in this next clip. One of which we're going to expand upon later in the broadcast. That is the great Tito Puente. And you're just going to get a glimpse of Tito Puente in this particular clip. But mention is going to be made of two very, very important rooms in New York City during the growth and heyday of Afro-Latin jazz, specifically the Park Palace and the Palladium. So here we go first of all with an introduction to the great Ernesto Tito Puente, and then some discussion by some serious dancers and jazz people as they talk about their tenure at the Park Palace and more specifically the Palladium. Enjoy this.
Contributing to the new sound was a 17-year-old Puerto Rican drummer who understood the complex polyrhythms of Cuba, though he was born and raised in New York City. His name was Ernest Anthony Puente Jr., affectionately known as Tito.
Tito Puente displayed virtuosity, musical vision, and an understanding of this innovation. He's immediately allowed to sit in at the very first performances on Central Park North in that basement club, and is uncredited playing timbales on some of the first Machito records today. He's there.
Cap Calloway did acknowledge, after seeing the Machito Afro-Cubans, he did acknowledge it. He said that, well, this music is the music of the future.
It took a while for the new music to catch, but when it did, wildfire erupted. Suddenly, Latin music was the height of hip, and Machito and his Afro-Cubans were the stratosphere at clubs like La Conga, the Beachcomber, and the Park Palace.
There was a place called the Park Palace. That was the place that really gave rise to the Mambo Wars.
It was a neighborhood dance hall. It was our Puerto Ricans thing. Nobody else came in. We had the best of everything. Arsenio Rodriguez, Machito, Afarone Eki, Marcelino Guerra in them days. Nora Morales.
It was one thing to rock the house in East Harlem, but could this music travel downtown? When a lackluster Lindy Hop joint named the Alma Dance Studio changed its name to the Palladium in 1947, it also changed the course of African-Cuban music.
That's when Tommy Morton came in
started managing.
And all of a sudden his business started to go down. The Latin music was very popular and everybody was running to the Latin. And him and the rest of his partners got together and they said, we gotta get a band in here and make some of that money.
And Mario Bauza asked Mr. Morton, how do you feel about black people? And Morton's reply was, according to Mario Bauza, I'm only interested in the color of green, meaning money. He says, well, Mario suggests, let's try a Latin night and see how that works out.
I went down for the opening night of that 3:30 in the afternoon on the Palladium with Machito. When I got downtown to 53rd Street and Broadway, do you know what was happening? Not one line, two lines. Around from 53rd Street, around Broadway, up 54th Street, around to 7th Avenue. Two lines. The cops had to close off 7th Avenue, Broadway, no traffic to go to it because of the crowd. They thought it was going to be a riot. All for that opening of the Palladium.
Walking up the flight of steps just built a certain anxiety in me that, oh, I gotta get there, I can't miss what's going on.
If the band was on, you sort of danced up the stairs.
Everyone dressed in those days. Everybody had a suit and a tie and wingtip shoes and the whole bit.
The rest of the week, you know, my mom was a seamstress in a sweatshop, and we were students in these really rough high schools. The night you went to the Palladium, you were a princess. And so we would get all dressed up, and the minute you go up those stairs, you change.
And many of the older girls, a little older than I did, used to dress up, really dress to kill. Gold lame and black with sequins.
There was this sense that you had entered another world. It would be noisy. You could not have a conversation because these bands would be going like crazy.
On the right-hand side, there was a kind of giant armchair, if you will, where everyone would sit watching the dances. And then on the left side, you'd have the tables.
And my mother came in her jewelry and her fur coat. And my father gave someone a tip and we got a center table.
Every Wednesday, you were square if you didn't go to the Palladium.
There was the sense of, I am a part of this music and this music is part of me.
It became chic to be there. Wednesday nights, you go and you see Sammy Davis Jr., you'd see Marlon Brando, and you'd see so-and-so from Hollywood, you know, and they'd want to be seen there.
And I said, who's your friends? He said, this is Novak. Kim Novak. I said, you got it. I backed off. Sure enough. But she liked to dance.
Many of the celebrities started to converge on the Palladium. I remember seeing Marlon Brando there one night. He was playing the conga on a Wednesday.
That was really a spot more for the hip crowd, the in crowd, the celebrity crowd, the mobster, Goodfellow crowd.
Candido has told me stories about Marlon Brando sitting in with the Machito Orchestra. And he even told me that you know, he has tapes of Marlon Brando playing quinto, the solo drum in rumba. And he says, hey, you gotta hear him play. He sounds really, really good. I mean, it's not no fake thing. He's really, you know, playing in the style authentically.
Ava Gardner come in and she loved to dance, okay? She had a certain appetite for chocolate, okay? And she would come in, dance with me, dance with me.
And La Lupe was a singer herself and a performer, and she was there with an entourage. And Isabel Sarli was this very sultry, sort of like the Marilyn Monroe of Brazil. Of course, when they would get up to dance, definitely, even though they were not nearly as good as we were, you would part for them.
This Dizzy Gillespie used to come up with Sarah Vaughan all the time. Lena Horne, Rita Hayworth. And I had the privilege of dancing one number with Liz Taylor.
Writers like William Burroughs, Allen Ginsberg. I go crazy when I see these things about Jackson Pollock. This avant-garde concept and the swirls and this, abstract thing. Man, where do you think he got that from? He's listening to mambo music. He puts a canvas on the floor, boom. He's listening to Machito and the Afro-Cubans, boom. He starts dancing and throwing the paint everywhere, man.
The forces of Africa, Cuba, jazz, and innovation had crystallized at the Palladium Ballroom. Now Latin music had a special time and a remarkable place.
The Palladium must have been quite a place. They shut down in roughly 1966, but for approximately 20 years, that was the place to be. If you wanted to dance and groove to the rhythms of Latin America combined with American jazz. Great stuff. You heard some commentary by some very important people during that period. Among them, Mr. Ray Barreto, one of the great congueros of our time. You heard some comments by one of the principal dancers at the Palladium, Miss Barbara Craddock. You're going to hear from her later on. And you also heard some very, very informative and informed comments from the great dancer, one of the best dancers in the history of the Palladium. They knew him as Cuban Pete. His given name was Pedro Aguilar. And no, Cuban Pete wasn't from Cuba. He was from Puerto Rico. But nevertheless, he became Cuban Pete. And as you heard him mention, he had opportunities to dance with a lot of the celebrities during that time. They all wanted to dance with Cuban Pete. Anywho, the Palladium, you heard mention of the Park Palace, among other important jazz rooms / Afro-Cuban music rooms as well. You often hear in any discussion of this genre the word salsa. And you're going to hear some salsa now as performed by La Reina de la Salsa. I'm talking about the one, the only, Miss Celia Cruz. In this case, she's working with one of the most important salsa bands of the 70s, namely the Fania All-Stars. In this case, what you're about to see under the direction of one of the great musicians during that era, Mr. Johnny Pacheco. And you're going to see, ever so briefly, Mr. Ray Barreto on congas, among many other musicians in this great band, all backing Miss Celia Cruz, and she's going to sing one of her signature tunes entitled Kimbara. This is La Reina herself, Miss Celia Cruz. The Queen of Salsa, Miss Celia Cruz, in concert in Zaire, Africa, 1974. The tune Kimbara, one of her signature tunes. She's backed by one of the great salsa bands, maybe the greatest of all time, the Fania All-Stars. Headed up by the very, very active Johnny Pacheco. That's great stuff. Por la salsa. We're going to return to our historical perspective now. During the heyday of the Palladium in New York City, roughly a 20-year run before it had to shut down for various reasons. But in the early days of the Palladium, inevitably there was competition among some of the great orchestras of the time. And this next segment is going to put the spotlight on what they call the Big Three. That is the three most important and popular orchestras of the time during the late 40s into the early 1950s. The orchestras of the two Titos and Machito, specifically Machito and his Afro-Cubans, Tito Puente's orchestra, and Tito Rodriguez's orchestra. Enjoy this next clip.
So while most of the U.S. and the world saw Pérez Prado as the king of the mambo, New York, with its jazzier sounds and decades-old Latin music scene, had its own royalty, known as the Big Three. Machito and his Afro-Cubans were the elder statesmen. The two other contenders had grown up in El Barrio. Tito Rodriguez was born in Puerto Rico and moved to New York as a young boy. By the 1950s, the suave singer led his own band. While his hot numbers burned, Rodriguez was also known for his romantic boleros.
Tito Rodriguez was a crooner. He used to dance with the women and take his microphone and just look into their eyes and just sing these beautiful ballads, and the girls would just melt on the floor.
But there was another Tito too. Tito Puente was born in El Barrio, just 3 years after his parents arrived from Puerto Rico. Always interested in music, as a teenager he turned away from that of his parents. For Puente, nothing beats swing. At 14, he saw drummer Gene Krupa at the Paramount Theater. I knew right there what I wanted, to be Gene Krupa, he later said. But Puente found immediate work in the local Latin bands and took up the timbales. He soon found himself under the wing of Mario Balsa.
He was one of my mentors, taught me a lot about playing, performing, rehearsing bands, because I worked with Machito for quite a few years. Then the war came around and I was drafted.
A bugler and gunner's mate in the Navy, Puente saw combat in World War II. He also played saxophone in bands to entertain the crews. By the end of the 1940s, Puente was running his own band and revolutionizing the role of the timbales.
He starts making the instrument a vibrant force in the orchestra. Very much like Gene Krupa. Before Gene Krupa, drummers were not featured artists or anything like that. All of a sudden, Gene Krupa comes out and he's like a featured soloist. Tito does the same thing.
Puente was just getting started. His career as a consummate musician, band leader, and arranger lasted over 50 years.
As Mario Balsa said many, many times, nobody has done more for Afro-Cuban music than Tito Puente. Nobody.
the Big Three battled nightly for supremacy in New York, before legions of new fans.
We were called Mambo Nicks, with the N-I-C-K-S on the end. And we were like guys that liked to mambo and liked to dance. And really, the only place to go was the Palladium.
In Midtown Manhattan, the Palladium had once been a dance studio. Now, it was the home of the mambo.
First time I was at the Palladium, I would say is one of the highlights of my life. I was just a teenager, and I was out to dinner with my parents, and they took me to the Palladium. And we sat down, and my mother was wearing a mink coat and jewelry. And here was this mixture of people, every race, every color, every creed, all dancing together. The MC came out and said, and here they are, the couple you've been waiting for, Cuban Pete and Millie. And the audience went crazy, absolutely crazy. They came out and they did this wild mambo. And you have to remember that he was tan, café con leche. And she was white. And in 1955, to have a mixed couple dance on a stage, any stage, had never been done before.
The Big Three, Tito Rodriguez's orchestra, Tito Puente's orchestra, and Machito and his Afro-Cubans. Brief profile of three giants and their bands that spent a lot of time at the Palladium in New York City. You saw a relatively brief profile of the great Tito Puente, and what I want to do next is provide a more in-depth profile of this giant of music. And some of the things you've already heard about Tito Puente's life, how he not only played timbales, they call him El Rey del Timbal, but he also played saxophone, he played bugle, and notably, he played vibraphone as well. He was an extraordinary musician who, as you heard mentioned in this last clip, was on the scene for 50 plus years making this music happen, and characterized as perhaps the most important individual in the history of this music. So I think, let's go to that profile of Tito Puente. We are into part 7. I can't believe we've gone through 6 segments of this history with you. A reminder that next week, not a reminder, actually this is the first time I'm sharing this with you. If all goes according to plan, next week we are going to feature 3 wonderful musicians, 2 of whom are vocalists and 1 of whom you saw last semester, accompanying a marvelous singer, and I'll leave it at that. That's next week, so please tune in next Tuesday, 7 p.m., another 3 hours of straight ahead jazz plus. We're going to have some fun. And in the course of talking about the careers of the 2 featured vocalists next week, we're going to also put the spotlight on some of their mentors. And I think you'll get a big kick out of what we have to share for next week. And my hope is that you were with us last week when we featured Henry the Skipper Franklin, his trio with a wonderful vocalist by the name of Mandy Gaines. But I want to return to our profile of Tito Puente, El Rey del Timbal, the king of the timbales, but he played more than timbales, as I mentioned. Here we go.
Tito Puente was the most exciting person, instrumental musician, that I've ever seen on a stage. just by the very nature of what he played. And I think he brought a sense of American popular music done in a Latin style.
I've always thought Tito had the biggest ego ever existed.
I loved that about Tito Puente, that he knew he was good, and he wasn't going to pretend that he wasn't. There was no false modesty there.
You have a person that really knew his craft. I don't really call that ego. I call that pride.
When I was 15 years old, and Tito Puente gave me permission to sit next to him, and I watched him play in the tag. I saw Tito Puente play. I just was mesmerized.
And he used to break 100 sticks a night, and I used to collect all the sticks at the end of the night and take them home, and I bought a pair of old Zimgar timbales, Mexican, the worst timbales. I always wanted to play the drum, so Tito played short sticks, so I had half a stick, so they were Tito Puente sticks.
He was not just a musician, arranger, composer. He was an extraordinary showman.
Tito didn't play 2 timbales, he played 4 of them, or 6 of them, and would dance around in a circle and do a show.
Timbales and brought them to the front of the orchestra.
He always looked at the instrument not as an instrument just to play rhythms on, but as a musical instrument that was capable of many melodic tonal variations.
They call him Cuban King. At age 16, Tito became a musician full-time, and within 2 years was playing drums with the Noro Morales Orchestra, where Tito gained his first film screen exposure. At age 19, Tito was at a crossroads, first with Machito and his Afro-Cubans, then with the U.S. Navy during World War II, when he was stationed aboard the USS Santee. There, Tito saw combat, learned arranging from his fellow musicians, and was the ship's bugler.
And as you know, the bugler, they sound reveille and the call to arms. He would always warm up his lips, his chops, playing something, Inadvertently, one day he had put the microphone was on, and he starts to play a call to arms, battle stations. So the whole damn ship goes into complete battle stations, only to find out that it was a false alarm. He says, so all you heard on the ship is, where's that little Ernestito? Because we're gonna kick his ass. He said, I hid. For the next 3 days you couldn't find little Ernestito. He got, by the way, a presidential commendation for engaging the enemy in 9 sea battles. Never talks about those experiences.
Honorably discharged, Tito returned to New York to study music, courtesy of the GI Bill, at the renowned Juilliard School. While studying, he joined the Jose Curbelo Orchestra, whose lead singer was Tito Rodriguez, his childhood friend. In 1947, Tito became the musical director and drummer of the Pupi Campo Orchestra. The next year, Tito stormed into the Palladium Ballroom.
They were doing a gig, and the piano player showed up late. And Tito, being the kind of guy he was, one monkey don't stop no show. And he sat down at the piano, and he even did these solos that were incredible, and he played.
Well, the vibes were his next instrument, and I heard him play it many times. He played it at Birdland. He played saxophone. And he played about 5 different sets of drums.
He just put 2 sticks in his hand and he'd go. Sometimes we'd arrive to play in a place out on the road where the crowd would be kind of scanty, and he'd play for 10 people as if there were 10,000 people out there.
And we were flying on a flight, and I messed up with my ticket, and I accidentally was placed in first class, which was fine with me. And Tito comes in and sits right next to me. I was like, great. All of a sudden he goes, oh no, I forgot my charts. I don't have any music. Does he have any music paper? I said, yeah. He said, how many horns are on this gig? And I said, well, there's 6. He said, okay. And I watched him, just from memory, arrange with no piano, nothing. 3 numbers for 6 horns. Now tell me, how many percussionists in this world can do that?
And as he went on in years, it still was impressive every time I saw him. When he was starting to reach his full stride and making good money, here he was playing the timbales, singing every song, and dancing.
You sit down with Tito, he'd tell you that Xavier Cugat was one of his favorite bands. A guy so hip, you would say, wow, Xavier Cugat, why would he, you know, he was a dancer, and he loved to dance to that music.
He started out as a dancer. He used to do dance routines with his younger sister, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old.
So, at a very early age, Tito learned the importance of dance, and he never forgot that as a band leader.
He really made you feel like he was playing that music for you.
Tito changed my life because I got to see him when I was 12 years old. He came to perform in a street concert. My heart was pounding. Everybody else's heart was pounding. He's just slaying everybody, man. He's the man.
His performance was in your face, aggressive, fast. Take no prisoners.
All of a sudden, the last chord of the arrangement, pow, comes in and you go, whoa, what is that chord, man? Well, it's Tito.
And Tito Puente's band was Charlie Palmieri, was Mongo Santa Maria, was Ray Barretta, was Willie Bobo. I mean, and Tito. I mean, imagine all those people in one band.
Even though the instrument of timbales is a Cuban-born instrument, it's what we call un instrumento criollo, was born on the island of Cuba. The greatest player, the greatest protagonist of that instrument has been a New York-born Puerto Rican, Tito Puente. And he was very proud of being Puerto Riqueño, even though he made his living playing Afro-Cuban based music.
He was a role model second to none in the Puerto Rican community of the barrio because he was the first person to transcend the limits of that community.
And Tito at 75 was 15 years old. You know, the same verb we used to destroy New York together, man.
Kind of remind me of James Cagney. He had that same kind of persona, you know, larger than life. I think that carried him to the day he died.
The Palladium sound, tight, percussive, complex, and delivered with pure showmanship, today circles the planet. And no one ignited that world beat with more energy and understanding than Tito Puente.
He was a giant, truly. As important a figure in this music as anyone in the music. Tito Puente, multi-talented. When I first learned of his arranging abilities, I just said, wow, this guy was the total package, truly, the total package. And what a great spokesperson for the music as well. We're going to move from a fairly in-depth profile of Tito Puente to a consideration of, again, the further development of Afro-Cuban music, with a look at a subject that is near and dear to all you jazzers out there, your hearts. That is a discussion of this thing called bebop. And any discussion of bebop has to mention the likes of Charlie Parker and, of course, Dizzy Gillespie. And more specifically, as I alluded to earlier, Dizzy Gillespie's collaboration with the great Chano Pozo. Again, this is another look at the history of this music to provide some perspective for you so that you can incorporate these elements as you listen to these fabulous polyrhythms with that roaring band on the top. Or as Mario Balsa characterized it, it's just like lemon meringue pie. The jazz sensibilities on the top with those Afro-Cuban rhythms on the bottom. Again, we're talking the period that roughly spanned the years 1940 1945 to roughly 1990, really. So a return to our historical perspective with a focus on a remarkable collaboration between Dizzy Gillespie and Chano Pozo.
Birdland, the home of the new progressive jazz called bebop. Developed first by trumpeter Dizzy Gillespie and his second in command, alto saxophonist Charlie Parker. Featuring angular melodies, complex harmonies, and hypnotic solos. It was as difficult for the musicians to play as the audience to understand.
The Palladium was a couple of blocks removed from Birdland. And that was the mecca of the jazz world. So musicians would move back and forth to check each other out.
In the radius of probably 3 blocks, there were all the innovations probably that had happened in America in the last 50 years. It was like an incubator, spawning team. That's what everybody that came to New York, if they loved bebop, they went to Birdland. If you wanted the right night, you'd go into the Palladium. It's an amazing time. I was like a kid, I was like Dracula at the Blood Bank. I was so excited. Every minute there was something to see.
Mongo and Eddie and Tito and Ray Barretto, who all loved jazz. So that's the key. The jazz musicians loved Latin music, and the Latin musicians loved jazz. So you would get Bird and Dizzy and Miles Davis and Thelonious Monk, and all the great stars would always find their way up there because the music was so exciting and so dynamic.
The marriage has always been there. They understood each other perfectly. It's almost like double-time brass licks, over this serious polyrhythmic rhythm section. And it's just like a train that you couldn't stop.
Dizzy Gillespie, Dexter Gordon, Stan Getz, Zoot Sims. These are all people that I saw actually playing solos with Machito's band.
You listen to the music of certain jazz things from the late 40s and 50s and even into the early 60s, you'll see many Latin devices in the music.
That's what happened with Cal Jada. He was playing with George Shearing. Al McKibben tells him, hey, let's go across the street. Tito Puente's playing at the Palladium. Oh yeah, he goes over there. He sees Tito Puente playing vibes. He goes, wow, man, vibes in Latin music and Afro-Cuban music. What happens? Cal Jada becomes a mambo nigga.
Dizzy Gillespie was responsible mostly for this Latin jazz movement many years in the 40s when he had this great Chano Pozo and he did this great standard called Manteca, which everybody knows. And he did all kinds of jazz things that they always had that Latin rhythmic pattern involved.
Jazz was the maximum of harmonic structure. That's what was being fed to the conscientious Latin player. For example, how that influenced Rene Hernandez, who was the arranger of the Machito Orchestra when he comes from Cuba, when he hears Stan Kenton, when he hears Dizzy Gillespie, when he hears Count Basie's band. Wow, and then he incorporates that naturally to the jazz harmonic structures to the Machito Orchestra. That's why the orchestra and its recordings were just unmatchable and in the greatest orchestra we've ever had.
Renowned for his complex arrangements, Mario discovered a talent who took arranging for the Machito band to the highest level, Chico O'Farrell, considered by many the greatest arranger in the history of African-Cuban music. Mario and Machito had another secret weapon, Machito's sister, Graciela, the grande dame of balladeers.
jazz music has always been married at the hip, always. They couldn't help it because it's about the same thing. They love very hip harmonies, very hip rhythmical values, and complex rhythmic values.
The old songs that came out of Cuba, the standards, the Vacilons and the Monkeys, Wapacha, the beginnings of Cha-Cha-Cha, stuff like that, were very simple, had very simple lyrical content and musical content too. Basically, there were 2 or 4 chords, and the lyrics were mostly a bailar, a gozar, I want to dance, I want to have a good time, come out with me tonight, dance with me. I love you, baby. You know, that was it. And what was happening is the musicians, the New York Latin musicians would come around and they would start, we used to jam. Instead of playing straight triads or 6 chords, we were now going to ninths and augmented 13th chords and 11th chords and substitute chordal systems to expand the harmonies and to be able to play more creative improvisations, more creative music, kind of mixture of jazz and Latin music together.
Took on a kind of life of its own compared to music that was traditionally strictly from Cuba or strictly from Puerto Rico.
Tito had just started his big band, and he would use Doc Severinsen, he would use Al Kahn and Zoot Sims, and you know, a lot of the jazz guys, Cannibal Adderley, and they would cross over into the Latin scene, and then Tito would reciprocate and play on their albums.
It was a cross-pollinization of one another, and I think the Latins got plenty from the jazzers, and the jazzers got plenty from the Latins.
No jazzer got more than Dizzy Gillespie. He went to his mentor Mario Bauza, looking for the African-Cuban sound for his own band.
The story goes that Dizzy was talking to Mario, saying, Cuban rhythms, man, it's so deep. There's so many different variations, and the rhythm that we use in jazz is pretty limited. It's just swing, a couple of variations of that, 2-beat and 4-beat feels, but that's it. How can we make the rhythm in jazz more interesting? Mario said, man, just use Latin rhythms. And he said, I know this conga player in Cuba who's a consummate performer, and you got to meet him. He's a friend of mine. His name's Chano Pozo.
Renowned as a composer, dancer, master percussionist, and showman, Chano was also well-versed in the West African-based religious traditions of Santeria, Palo, and Abakwa. For the first time, jazz was enlivened with African chants and Chano's own explosive drumming.
When a musician like Chano Pozo comes to New York, a proud, dark-skinned Cuban, proud of his African roots and asserting those African roots in the music, it spoke to the American jazz musicians on a level that no one had before. Dizzy Gillespie made a comment. I didn't speak Spanish and Chano Pozo didn't speak English, but that didn't matter because together we spoke African.
Like 2 long-lost brothers separated by slavery, Dizzy and Chano reunited the rhythmic roots of jazz and African-Cuban music in their masterpiece, Manteca.
Dizzy Gillespie's exploration into Afro-Cuban music was really an exploration into his own African roots.
Palladian musicians were also exploring, hoping to cross over to the respect and riches of mainstream America.
Dizzy and Chano, that's quite a collaboration. A little history for you. Again, I would strongly recommend that you delve into the history of this great fusion of very distinct styles. And again, a strong recommendation that you consider Scott Yanow's Afro-Cuban Jazz. It's a good title, good read. We are now going to move away from Cuba and Puerto Rico and New York City and head south to South America, ever so briefly, and features some music from Brazil. Starting off with a concert that took place at the Grande Teatro do Palácio das Artes in Brazil, 2005, and featured one of the great Brazilian musicians of all time. And I'm not talking about Tom Jobim either. Stay tuned. We're going to begin our relatively brief exploration of the music coming from Brazil with the great Milton Nascimento in concert, and a tune entitled Cachanga will return, and then turn the spotlight on arguably the most important musician ever to come out of Brazil, Mr. Antonio Carlos Jobim. But first up, Milton Nascimento.
Haja o que houver, a fome de dia poder morder a carne dessa mulher. Veja bem, meu patrão, como pode ser? Você trabalharia no sol e eu tomando banho de mar. Desejos, coisas dessa vida e da outra, mas nada de assustar. Quem não é sincero sai da brincadeira correndo, pois pode se queimar. Saio do trabalho, volto para casa. Não lembro de canseira maior, em tudo é o mesmo suor. Nem faltava o fogo, todo mundo abrindo o jogo, conto que tem pra contar. Casos e desejos, coisas dessa vida e da outra, mas nada de assustar. Quem não é sincero sai da brincadeira correndo, pois pode se queimar. Não lembro de canseira maior, em tudo é o mesmo suor.
guitarist, bassist, Milton Nascimento, gifted artist. With his ensemble, recorded in 2005, and this particular tune, entitled Cachanga, featured vocalist and drummer Miss Marina Machado, another noted Brazilian artist that you might want to check out. Milton Nascimento, a giant. And now we're going to feature the Duke Ellington of Brazilian music, arguably the most important music artist that come out of Brazil. Mr. Antonio Carlos Jobim, known by his friends as Tom Jobim. And in this case, he came together with some familiar faces. I'm sure you jazzers out there will recognize most of the musicians on this date. It was an all-star tribute to Jobim, held in 1994, just a few months before his untimely passing. But you'll get an opportunity to see Jobim and company, who I'll identify after this next tune, interpret one of Jobim's most popular tunes entitled Wave. This is an all-star tribute to the immortal Antonio Carlos Jobim. The great Antonio Carlos Jobim, who you've heard playing piano and having a grand time with these giants of jazz. 1994, not too long after this particular concert at Carnegie Hall in New York City, Tom Jobim left us, but again, his legacy of music remains ever so strong. And in the hearts of all of us, you probably recognize some of those all-stars who joined Jobim on this date, namely on keyboards and taking a few choruses at the grand piano, Mr. Herbie Hancock. The bassist, Ron Carter. There are two guitarists, one of whom was Jobim's son, Paulo Jobim, on one of the guitars, and Oscar Castro Neves on the other. Harvey Mason played drums, and Alex Acuna playing various percussion instruments. Classic stuff, Antonio Carlos Jobim. A demonstration of the bossa nova, a very, very important Latin jazz component of this thing called music. You heard mention made earlier of one of the great arrangers in Latin jazz. I'm talking about the late, great Chico O'Farrill. His son, noted pianist, arranger, composer, Arturo O'Farrill, O'Farrill, I guess that it'd be pronounced, south of the border, came together as part of a project to explore the music of his father, Chico, and to also consider the collaboration and contributions of Chano Pozo and Dizzy Gillespie. And maybe more importantly, given the tenor of the times, you're going to hear not only the narrator of this piece, the great bassist and orchestra leader, Christian McBride, as well as Arturo O'Farrill, talk about the Cuban embargo. Things loosened up just a few years ago under the leadership of former President Barack Obama. Things have tightened since then. A lot more tension between the United States and Cuba. That's the reality. But when this was recorded in 2015, just a couple of years ago, that embargo was beginning to weaken, and much more communication and collaboration was taking place between the United States and that little island 90 miles south of Florida, Cuba. Anyway, that's a setup for this next piece you're going to see, with a commentary, early commentary by the great Christian McBride, and Arturo O'Farrill, son of the great Chico O'Farrill, talking about the embargo, and then subsequently playing a piece with his orchestra that pays homage to his father.
O'Farrill grew up in the U.S., but his father Chico was a renowned composer from Cuba, which is where we're headed in this episode. Now, you can't talk about Cuba without mentioning the embargo. Since 1960, almost nothing has crossed that 90-mile gap.
The embargo is it's a terrible thing. I mean, people don't realize that we've actually really hurt an already impoverished nation with this ridiculous policy. It's just insane.
Anything that came from or went to Cuba was smuggled, jazz included. That fact drives Arturo as a pianist and composer.
Well, it began in 2002 when I first visited Havana, and the first thing that I encountered was great gugabs of young jazz musicians who worked really hard to master this craft we thought was our own.
For Arturo, this inspired an idea. Before the embargo, the African-American virtuoso trumpeter Dizzy Gillespie was developing a new idea called bebop when he met the world's greatest Afro-Cuban conga player, Chano Pozo.
Dizzy Gillespie and Chano Pozo are sitting on some bar, on some cloud, in some bar on some cloud, still discussing why the music that they came from really comes from the same roots.
Neither one spoke the other's language, but they communicated through the roots of jazz, Afro-Latino rhythms.
Discovering that in each other is the roots of each other's music was a moment of incredible clarity for both of them. That conversation began the discovery of something that's far deeper than anything that either one of them realized. And it's a conversation that was not stopped by revolution, by death, by ideology, by poverty, by commerce. It was not stopped.
So Arturo decided to make a record. He called it Cuba. The conversation continues.
The album was an attempt to get 6 composers to envision what that music sounds like. That music that is neither jazz nor Cuban, but universal music.
Every composition on the album was a commissioned work for continuing the musical conversation. Last December, Arturo flew his big band to Havana to record the songs, but the day after they landed in Cuba, something unexpected happened.
Good afternoon. Today, the United States of America is changing its relationship with the people of Cuba. We are taking steps to increase travel, commerce, and the flow of information to and from Cuba. We will end an outdated approach that for decades has failed to advance our interests, and instead, we will begin to normalize relations between our two countries.
There was a moment when I was standing outside where we rehearsed, where it hit me really hard. I thought of 2 things. I thought of my father, who would have been overjoyed to see this day, and I also started weeping because I thought of all the poverty and hardship that these people have suffered because of the embargo.
Arturo found himself in Cuba during a pivotal political moment, but he still had to make that album. On the album, Arturo honored his father, Chico O'Farrell, by reimagining Chico's masterpiece, the Afro-Cuban Jazz Suite, composed 65 years before. Arturo's version incorporates elements from all the Americas and calls it the Afro-Latin Jazz Suite, featuring Rootresh Mahanthapa on the saxophone. Here's the final movement called What Now?
Arturo O'Farrill at the piano and his Latin Jazz Orchestra. They played the fourth movement of the Afro-Latin Jazz Suite, inspired by his father, Chico O'Farrill, entitled What Now? And it featured, obviously, Arturo O'Farrill at the piano, Jim Seeley on trumpet, and Rudresh Mahanthappa on alto saxophone. This was recorded again in 2015. What Now from the Afro-Latin Jazz Suite, movement number 4. That's just a portion of that suite that you got an opportunity to hear. What I want to do now is play the Afro-Cuban Jazz Suite as conducted by, who else? Mr. Chico O'Farrill. In roughly 2000, Chico O'Farrill was coming to the end of his career and, frankly, his life. But he got together with the Cats at Birdland in New York City and recorded this great interpretation of his own Afro-Cuban Jazz Suite, which was originally presented back in the late 1940s and into the early 1950s, and featured, among others, the great Charlie Parker taking extended solos during this suite. But this is an updated version as conducted by Mr. Chico O'Farrill himself. Ladies and gentlemen, the Afro-Cuban Jazz Suite. And I better be quiet because the voice is starting to give out. I think you'll enjoy this next selection. the Afro-Cuban Jazz Suite, conducted and arranged by the great Chico O'Farrill. This was recorded in 2000 as part of the Calle 54 compilation of songs, suites by some of the great Afro-Caribbean musicians of the time. Just a few names of guys in the band: Jack Jeffers in the trombone section playing bass trombone, Papo Vasquez in the trombone section, Michael Philip Mossman playing trumpet, Arturo O'Farrill at the piano. Just some great musicians who came together to perform this classic suite written, and in this case conducted by Chico O'Farrill, the year 2000. So much music, so little time. Let me move forward and feature one of the great salseros of our time, and for many years. And he hails not from Cuba, not from Puerto Rico, but rather from Venezuela in South America. He's working with a fellow Venezuelan. I'm talking about el cantante Mr. Oscar de Leon, working with pianist, band leader Porfi Baloa. And they're going to do a little thing entitled Clase Social, and this was recorded in 2015. The great Oscar de Leon.
Así ella no te deje de amar, dicen ellos.
Salseros, the great Oscar de Leon, working with Porfi, Baloa, all from Venezuela. Porfi and his band of renown. From a little thing in the studio from 2015, the song Clase Social, Oscar de Leon. Always exciting, still making great music, and that tenor is just remarkable. Very quickly, as we quickly run out of time, I just want to share with you some upcoming appearances by some special people. On Halloween, that's right, the 31st, I'm inviting in a former on-air host from K-Jazz, and he's going to come in and talk about his career in the broadcasting booth at one of the top jazz stations in America, K-Jazz. Mr. Brad Williams is going to join us. All of this, obviously, is if all goes according to plan. So that's on Halloween. In November, among others, on the 14th, Mr. Jeffrey Littleton, renowned bassist, is going to join me. He's visited us before working with others, but in this case, he's going to come in and talk about his career and put the spotlight on some of the great bass players of all time. The following week, the 21st, the great trumpeter, track and field star, Mr. Nolan Shahid, will rejoin me to talk about trumpet playing and cornet playing and flugelhorn playing. On the 28th of November, again, if all goes according to plan, I'm going to be joined by two of my closest associates, Mr. Jeffrey Winston, who comes in each and every semester to talk about a given subject related to jazz. But in this case, he's going to be joined by another close associate, Mr. Clint Rosemont, who has joined me in the past on several occasions. And we are going to talk about a festival that we used to put together called the the World Stage Jazz Festivals. There were roughly 5 of them, and we want to talk about them in some detail and put the spotlight on some great musicians who came in to pay tribute to jazz stars of yesteryear who had such a huge impact on the jazz community. And during those 4 or 5 years of the World Stage Jazz Festival, we had an opportunity to bring in some of the top musicians in Southern California as they paid tribute to some of the greats, people like Dexter Gordon and Harold Land, among others. And then finally, on the first Tuesday in December, I will be rejoined once again, and he always has a standing invitation to join us. Mr. Charlie Owens and company will rejoin me on our last broadcast scheduled for Tuesday, December 5th, all at 7 p.m. We're going to close with the gentleman we featured earlier on, Mr. Willie Bobo. This comes from Willie Bobo's date entitled Spanish Grease from 1965. The name of the tune, Nessa. We'll see you next Tuesday at 7. Have a great rest of the week. We're back. False start. Next tune on the list. We'll see you next week.